You think you know what death looks like? Of course you don't. Nobody talks about the weight of an axe when it's slick with blood and your hands are trembling. But tonight, while you scroll through your phone in perfect safety, I'm going to tell you about the most terrifying job in human history. And when I'm done, you'll never look at your own reflection the same way again. Picture this. It's dawn in 1347, and you're standing on a wooden platform while hundreds of eyes burn into your soul. The condemned man kneels before you, and his final prayer mingles with the crowd's hungry whispers. Your grip tightens around the axe handle, and you realize something that would shatter your modern mind completely. You're not just about to kill someone, you're about to become something else entirely. Something that will haunt your dreams until the day you die, and maybe even after that. Because being an executioner in medieval times wasn't just a job. It was a transformation into the living embodiment of death itself. Let me paint you a picture that will crawl under your skin and stay there. Imagine waking up every morning knowing that today you might have to look into someone's eyes and watch the exact moment their soul leaves their body. Imagine the weight of that responsibility crushing down on your chest like a stone coffin lid. The smell hits you first, always the smell. It's not just blood, though there's plenty of that. It's the metallic tang of terror, the sour stench of bowels releasing in pure fear, the sick sweetness of death that clings to your clothes, your hair, your very essence. You'd scrub and scrub until your skin was raw, but that smell, it becomes part of you. You see, medieval executioners weren't just burly men swinging axes. They were walking contradictions, respected for their necessary service, yet shunned like lepers. They lived in a twilight world between the living and the dead, feared by the very people they served. Children would cross themselves when they passed. Women would cover their faces, and even hardened criminals would fall silent in their presence. But here's what really would destroy you: the intimacy of it all. In our sanitized world, death happens behind closed doors in hospitals, clean and clinical. But as a medieval executioner, you'd be the midwife of death, present at the most raw, primal moment of human existence. You'd hold someone's life in your hands and feel it slip away like water through your fingers. The psychological toll was beyond comprehension. These men often turned to drink, not for celebration, but for the temporary erasure of memory. They'd sit in taverns where no one would speak to them, drowning in ale the faces of those they'd killed. Some went mad, talking to ghosts that only they could see. Others became hollow shells, their humanity carved away piece by piece with each swing of the blade. And the methods would haunt your nightmares forever. The breaking wheel, where victims were tied to a wooden wheel and had their bones systematically shattered with hammers. The executioner had to know exactly how much force to use, how to prolong suffering without causing immediate death. It was a grotesque art form, a dance between life and death that required precision and a complete abandonment of human empathy. Imagine having to learn the anatomy of suffering, where to strike to cause maximum pain but minimum blood loss, how to read the signs of impending death in someone's eyes. The executioner was part butcher, part surgeon, part priest, a trinity of terror that no human soul was meant to embody. Think about the apprenticeship process. You wouldn't just wake up one day and become an executioner. No, you'd start as a child, watching your father or uncle perform these horrific duties. You'd hold the tools, clean the blood, dispose of the bodies. Your childhood lullabies would be the screams of the condemned. Your bedtime stories would be tales of different torture methods. By the time you reached adulthood, your soul would already be fractured beyond repair. The tools themselves were works of dark artistry. The headsman's axe wasn't just a weapon, it was a carefully crafted instrument of death, weighted and balanced for maximum efficiency. The blade had to be sharp enough to cut through bone in a single stroke, yet heavy enough to generate the force needed. A dull blade meant multiple strikes, prolonged suffering, and a very angry crowd. But here's the part that would break you completely: the mistakes. Because even the most skilled executioner made them. A miscalculated angle, a moment of hesitation, a slippery grip, and suddenly you're standing over a writhing, screaming victim who's only partially decapitated. The crowd turns from bloodthirsty to horrified, and you have to finish what you started while your hands shake and your stomach churns. The psychological preparation was its own form of torture. The night before an execution, you'd sharpen your tools by candlelight, knowing that tomorrow you'd use them to end a human life. You'd practice your swings, feeling the weight of the axe, calculating the perfect arc. Some executioners would pray, others would drink themselves into a stupor, but all would face the same crushing reality. They were about to become the angel of death for someone's final moments. And the crowds were sometimes worse than the actual killing. They'd gather like vultures, screaming for blood, placing bets on how many strikes it would take. Children would push to the front for a better view, their innocent faces twisted with morbid curiosity. The executioner became both performer and pariah, simultaneously entertaining and horrifying the masses. The social isolation was suffocating. You'd live in a house marked by death, where visitors never came and neighbors crossed the street to avoid you. Your children would grow up knowing that their father was the bogeyman parents used to scare their kids into behaving. Be good, or the executioner will come for you in your sleep. Marriage was nearly impossible. What woman would want to lie next to hands that had taken so many lives? What mother would want those same hands to hold her children? The executioner's touch was considered cursed, tainted with the essence of death itself. Some executioners remained celibate their entire lives, not by choice, but by circumstance. The technical skills required were staggering. Different crimes required different methods of execution, each with its own set of rules and procedures. Treason called for drawing and quartering, a process so brutal that it would take hours to complete. Witchcraft demanded burning at the stake, where the executioner had to control the flames to ensure proper suffering before death. Theft might warrant hanging, but even that required knowledge of rope lengths, knot types, and body weight calculations. But perhaps the most horrifying aspect was the intimacy of the final moments. The executioner would often be the last person the condemned would see, the final face burned into their consciousness before eternal darkness. Some victims would beg, others would curse, but all would look into the executioner's eyes, seeking some flicker of humanity, some sign that they were seen as more than just a job to be completed. The executioner became a repository of secrets, carrying the final words and confessions of hundreds of souls. These whispered revelations would echo in their mind long after the bodies were buried, a chorus of the damned that never fell silent. Some executioners claimed they could hear the voices of the dead calling to them in the night, demanding justice, seeking revenge, or simply wanting to be remembered. But here's what would truly destroy your modern sensibilities: the children. Yes, medieval justice was so brutal that even children as young as 7 could face execution for serious crimes. Imagine being the person who had to end a child's life, knowing that those innocent eyes would haunt you forever. The weight of that responsibility would crush any remnant of your humanity. The aftermath of each execution was its own form of hell. The cleanup, the disposal of remains, the washing of blood from stones, all of it fell to the executioner. You'd scrub and scrub, but the stains would seem to reappear like accusations written in crimson. The tools would need to be cleaned and maintained, ready for the next time death came calling. And it always came calling. In medieval times, public executions were frequent entertainment, a grim reminder of the price of defying authority. The executioner was always on call, always ready to serve the crown's justice, always prepared to transform from man to monster at a moment's notice. The psychological transformation was gradual, but inexorable. Each execution chipped away at your humanity until you became something else entirely. A hollow shell animated by duty and deadened by horror. Your laughter would become hollow, your sleep would be filled with nightmares, and your waking hours would be haunted by the ghosts of your victims. But the worst part, the absolute worst part, was the moment you realized you'd become good at it. The moment when swinging the axe felt natural, when the sound of the blade cutting through flesh and bone became familiar, when you could look into someone's eyes and feel nothing. That's when you'd know you'd lost your soul completely, traded it for a few coins and the terrible efficiency of a perfect execution. So tell me, knowing all this, do you still think you could last a day as a medieval executioner? Could you carry the weight of so many deaths, live with the isolation, endure the psychological torment? Could you become the living embodiment of humanity's darkest impulses? The next time you complain about your job, remember the executioner's axe growing heavy in trembling hands. Remember the smell of death that never washes away, the screams that echo in empty rooms, the loneliness that eats you alive from the inside out, and sleep well, if you can. You thought the psychological torment was the worst part? How adorably naive. Let me tell you about the apprenticeship that would shatter your mind before you even touched your first victim. Because becoming an executioner wasn't something you chose. It was something that chose you, marked you, and consumed you from childhood like a cancer eating away at your soul. Picture yourself at 8 years old, standing in your father's shadow as he sharpens his tools. The grinding sound of metal against stone becomes your lullaby, and the smell of blood becomes as familiar as your mother's cooking. Except your mother left years ago, unable to bear the weight of what her husband had become, what her son was destined to become. Your first lesson isn't about technique or anatomy, it's about silence. You learn to watch as a man's head separates from his body, to see the fountain of blood that follows, to hear the wet thud as flesh meets wood, and you learn to show nothing. No flinching, no crying, no vomiting. Because weakness in an executioner's bloodline is a luxury that gets you killed. The medieval world had no patience for squeamish executioners. Your training begins with small animals, chickens, rabbits, sometimes a pig when your father wants to simulate human anatomy. You learn to grip the blade properly, to calculate the angle of impact, to read the subtle signs that tell you when death is approaching. Your hands, still small and innocent, become instruments of precise termination. But here's what would break your modern mind completely: the generational trauma. The executioner families passed down more than just technique. They passed down the accumulated horror of centuries. Your grandfather's nightmares became your father's reality, and your father's madness would become your inheritance. The family dinner table was where execution stories were shared like recipes, where methods were refined and improved upon. You'd learn that different social classes required different approaches. A noble's execution was a ceremonial affair, complete with elaborate rituals and precise protocols. The executioner would dress in his finest robes, often hooded to maintain anonymity, and perform the deed with theatrical flourish. But when it came to common criminals, efficiency mattered more than ceremony. Quick, brutal, and final. The tools of the trade were passed down like heirlooms, each one carrying the weight of countless lives. The family axe, its handle worn smooth by generations of death-dealing hands, would feel familiar in your grip because it was literally shaped by your bloodline. The blade would whisper stories of kings and peasants, saints and sinners, all equal in death. Your childhood games were practice sessions in disguise. While other children played with wooden swords, you learned to judge distances, to calculate the force needed to sever a spine, to understand the weak points in human anatomy. Your toys were miniature versions of torture devices. Your playground was the execution ground where you'd spend your adult life. The social conditioning was absolute. You'd grow up believing that your family served a sacred purpose, that death was a holy duty, that the screams of the condemned were prayers being answered. This psychological armor was necessary because without it, the horror would consume you before you reached adulthood. But the armor had cracks, and through those cracks seeped the true cost of your calling. You'd wake up at night, your sheets soaked with sweat, reliving executions you'd witnessed or performed. The faces of the dead would visit you in dreams, sometimes grateful, sometimes accusatory, always haunting. Sleep became a battlefield where you fought the ghosts of your victims night after night. The technical education was more complex than you could imagine. Different crimes required different methods, and each method had its own set of rules, traditions, and expectations. Beheading might seem straightforward, but the executioner had to know where to strike on the neck to ensure a clean cut, how to position the victim to prevent excessive blood spray, and when to display the severed head to satisfy the crowd's bloodlust. Hanging was an art form that required mathematical precision. The rope had to be exactly the right length. Too short and the victim would strangle slowly. Too long and the head might separate from the body. The knot placement was crucial, positioned to break the neck cleanly rather than cause prolonged suffering. A skilled executioner could calculate these variables instantly, accounting for the victim's weight, height, and physical condition. The breaking wheel was perhaps the most technically demanding method. The victim would be tied to a large wooden wheel, and the executioner would systematically break their bones with an iron hammer. The skill lay in knowing exactly how much force to use, which bones to break first, and how to time the injuries to maximize suffering while preventing immediate death. It was a grotesque choreography of agony that could last for hours. Burning at the stake required a different kind of expertise. The executioner had to understand how fire behaved, how to build a pyre that would burn efficiently, and how to position the victim to ensure proper combustion. Some executioners would show mercy by placing bags of gunpowder around the victim's neck, ensuring a quicker death when the flames reached them. Others would deliberately build the fire to burn slowly, maximizing the spectacle for the crowd. The tools themselves were works of dark craftsmanship. The headsman's axe was more than just a weapon. It was a precision instrument weighing between 6 and 12 pounds, with a blade shaped specifically for severing human necks. The handle was designed to provide maximum control and force, often wrapped in leather to prevent slippage when wet with blood. Swords used for execution were different from battle swords, typically heavier, and with a broader blade, designed for single, devastating strikes. The executioner would practice daily, maintaining the muscle memory and strength required to deliver a clean, merciful death. A skilled executioner took pride in his ability to kill with a single stroke, seeing it as a mark of professional competence. The psychological preparation rituals were as important as the physical training. Many executioners developed elaborate pre-execution routines, prayers, meditations, or drinking rituals that helped them enter the proper mental state. Some would speak to their tools, treating them as partners in the grim dance of death. Others would fast or engage in self-flagellation, believing that their own suffering somehow balanced the scales of justice. The relationship with the condemned was complex and deeply personal. In many cases, the executioner would spend time with the victim before the execution, sometimes serving as confessor, sometimes as comforter. This intimacy made the final act even more psychologically devastating. You'd learn someone's fears, their regrets, their final messages to loved ones, and then you'd kill them. Some executioners developed a twisted form of compassion, becoming experts at providing comfort in final moments. They'd whisper reassurances, offer prayers, or simply provide a human presence in the face of ultimate loneliness. This kindness made them more effective at their job, as grateful victims were more likely to cooperate and die with dignity. The crowd management was another crucial skill. Public executions were entertainment, and the executioner was the star performer. You'd learn to read the mood of the crowd, to time your actions for maximum dramatic effect, to satisfy their bloodlust while maintaining control of the situation. A skilled executioner could turn a routine execution into a memorable spectacle that would be talked about for years, but the performance came at a cost. Each execution was a piece of theater where you played the role of death incarnate, and gradually the mask would fuse with your face. The character you portrayed would consume the person you once were, leaving behind only the hollow shell of the executioner. The financial aspects were equally grim. Executioners were paid per execution, with rates varying based on the method and the social status of the victim. Noble executions commanded higher fees, while common criminals were dispatched for minimal compensation. The executioner also had rights to the condemned's clothing and possessions, creating a ghoulish economy built on death. Some executioners supplemented their income by selling pieces of the rope used in hangings, believed to have magical properties. Others would offer their services as torturers, using their expertise to extract confessions or information. The skills of death were surprisingly marketable in medieval society. The legal protections were minimal. If an execution went wrong, the executioner could face severe punishment, including death. The margin for error was zero, and the consequences of failure were absolute. This pressure created a constant state of anxiety that would eat away at your sanity like acid. You'd also learn about the different types of condemned individuals and how each category required different approaches. Political prisoners often faced death with dignity, seeing themselves as martyrs. Common criminals might beg or fight, requiring physical restraint and psychological manipulation. Religious heretics sometimes welcomed death as a pathway to martyrdom, creating their own unique challenges. The seasonal aspects of the job were another layer of horror. Winter executions were particularly brutal, as the cold made the blood congeal faster and the bodies stiffer. Summer executions brought their own problems. The heat would accelerate decomposition, and the smell of death would linger in the air for days. Each season brought its own technical challenges and psychological torments. But perhaps the most devastating aspect was the gradual realization that you were becoming something inhuman. The day would come when you'd look into a mirror and see not your own face, but the face of death itself. Your eyes would be empty, your smile would be hollow, and your touch would carry the chill of the grave. The next time you feel sorry for yourself, remember the child who learned to kill before he learned to love. Remember the man who traded his humanity for a handful of coins and the terrible efficiency of a perfect execution. And ask yourself, could you become the monster that medieval society required, or would you break long before the blade ever touched flesh? Sweet dreams, if the ghosts of the condemned allow it. You think you understand the depths of this nightmare? You've barely scratched the surface. Let me whisper to you about the day-to-day reality of living as death's servant, where every sunrise brings the possibility of ending someone's story forever. Because the true horror isn't just in the killing, it's in the waiting, the watching, the slow dissolution of everything that once made you human. Your morning routine would be a ritual of preparation for murder. You'd wake before dawn, not because you wanted to, but because sleep had become your enemy. The nightmares would chase you from your bed, and the silence of the early hours would offer the only peace you'd know. You'd sharpen your tools by candlelight, each stroke of the whetstone a prayer to gods who had long since abandoned you. The executioner's house was a monument to isolation. Built on the outskirts of town, it stood like a plague marker, warning decent folk to stay away. The walls were thick stone, not for defense, but to muffle the sounds that came from within. The screams that echoed in your memory, the sobs that escaped your lips in moments of weakness, the grinding of metal against metal as you prepared for the next death. Your neighbors were the dead. The execution ground was your backyard. The gallows was your garden. You'd tend to these instruments of death with the same care a farmer would show his crops, because your harvest was human lives, and your seasons were marked by the rhythm of judicial murder. The smell never left you. It wasn't just the metallic tang of blood or the sick sweetness of decay. It was deeper than that. It was the smell of fear, of final breaths, of souls departing flesh. It would cling to your clothes, your hair, your skin, marking you as surely as if you'd been branded. People could smell death on you from across the street, and they'd cross themselves and hurry away. Your wardrobe was a collection of death shrouds. The executioner's robes weren't just ceremonial. They were psychological armor, designed to transform you from man to monster in the eyes of the crowd. The hood wasn't just for anonymity. It was to hide your own humanity from yourself. When you put on those robes, you ceased to be a person and became an instrument of the state's will. The tools of your trade were more than weapons. They were extensions of your soul, or what remained of it. Each axe had its own personality, its own preferences, its own hunger for blood. You'd name them like beloved pets, whisper to them in the darkness, polish them until they gleamed like mirrors that reflected only death. The weight of them would become so familiar that your arms would ache when they weren't in your hands. But here's what would destroy your modern sensibilities completely: the bureaucracy of death. Every execution required paperwork, documentation, official approval. You'd receive written orders detailing the method of execution, the time, the location, sometimes even the specific prayers to be said. Death had become a clerical procedure, and you were just another civil servant processing human lives like tax documents. The condemned would be brought to you days before their execution, and you'd become their final confidant. They'd tell you things they'd never told their closest friends, confess sins that would make priests weep, share memories that would haunt you forever. You'd become a repository of human secrets, a living archive of final words and desperate prayers. Some would beg for mercy, offering you everything they owned, everything they'd ever owned, everything they'd ever dreamed of owning. Others would curse you, promising that their ghosts would torment you until your own death. A few would thank you, seeing death as a release from lives too painful to continue. Each reaction would carve itself into your memory, adding another layer to the psychological scar tissue that had replaced your heart. The children were the worst. Medieval justice was merciless to age, and you'd find yourself face to face with condemned souls barely old enough to understand what death meant. You'd look into their eyes and see not guilt or fear, but confusion, the bewilderment of innocence confronting the incomprehensible cruelty of the adult world. These executions would break something inside you that could never be repaired. The technical challenges were endless. Each body was different, each neck had its own anatomy, each victim required a slightly different approach. A thin person needed a different angle than a heavy one. A tall person required adjustments to the scaffold. An elderly person might have brittle bones that would complicate the process. You'd become an expert in human anatomy, but your knowledge was focused solely on the most efficient ways to end life. The crowd was another variable you'd have to master. Some executions drew hundreds of spectators, all screaming for blood, all demanding entertainment. Others were quiet affairs with only a few witnesses. You'd learn to read the mood, to time your performance for maximum effect, to satisfy their bloodlust while maintaining your own sanity. The crowd's reaction could make or break your reputation, and a failed execution could end your career and your life. The seasonal variations added another layer of complexity. Winter executions were brutal affairs where the cold would make your hands numb and your movements clumsy. The blood would freeze almost instantly, creating a crimson ice sculpture that would remain until spring. Summer executions brought their own horrors. The heat would accelerate decomposition, and the smell of death would linger in the air for days, a constant reminder of your work. The political aspects were equally treacherous. Executing a popular figure could turn you into a target for revenge. Killing a noble required navigating complex protocols and ancient traditions. Religious executions carried the weight of theological implications that could damn your soul in the eyes of the church. Every execution was a political act, and you were the instrument through which the state's power was expressed. The tools required constant maintenance. A dull blade meant a botched execution, multiple strikes, prolonged suffering, and an angry crowd. You'd spend hours each day sharpening, polishing, and caring for your instruments. The axe blade had to be perfect, sharp enough to cut through bone in a single stroke, yet not so thin that it would chip or break. The handle had to be balanced just right, wrapped in leather to prevent slipping when wet with blood. The rope for hangings was equally critical. It had to be strong enough to support the victim's weight, but flexible enough to stretch properly. The knot had to be positioned precisely to break the neck cleanly. Too high, and the victim would strangle slowly. Too low, and the head might separate from the body. You'd become an expert in the mathematics of death, calculating drop distances and rope lengths with the precision of an engineer. The psychological preparation rituals became more elaborate as the years passed. Some executioners would fast for days before an execution, believing that their own suffering somehow balanced the scales of justice. Others would drink themselves into a stupor, numbing their conscience with alcohol. A few would engage in self-flagellation, whipping themselves until they bled, seeking penance for the sins they were about to commit. The relationship with the local clergy was complex and often strained. Some priests would refuse to bless your tools or offer you communion, seeing you as irredeemably tainted by your profession. Others would work closely with you, believing that your role was divinely ordained. The church's position on executioners was ambiguous, necessary for justice, but spiritually contaminating for the soul. Your family life, if you had one, would be a constant battle against the darkness that consumed you. Your wife, if she stayed, would learn to recognize the signs of an approaching execution. The way you'd sharpen your tools obsessively, the way you'd stare into the fire for hours, the way you'd wake up screaming in the middle of the night. Your children would grow up knowing that their father was the bogeyman other parents used to frighten their kids into behaving. The financial aspects were as grim as everything else. You'd be paid per execution, with rates varying based on the method and the social status of the victim. Noble executions commanded higher fees, while common criminals were dispatched for minimal compensation. You'd also have rights to the condemned's clothing and possessions, creating a ghoulish economy built on death. Some executioners would supplement their income by selling pieces of rope used in hangings, believing they had magical properties. Others would offer torture services, using their expertise to extract confessions. The skills of death were surprisingly marketable in medieval society, but every transaction would cost you another piece of your humanity. The legal protections were minimal. If an execution went wrong, you could face severe punishment, including death. The margin for error was zero. The consequences of failure were absolute. This pressure would create a constant state of anxiety that would eat away at your sanity like acid, drop by drop, day by day. You'd develop superstitions and rituals to cope with the psychological pressure. Some executioners would never execute on certain days of the week, believing them to be cursed. Others would require specific prayers to be said or particular ceremonies to be performed. These rituals weren't just professional requirements. They were psychological crutches that helped you maintain the illusion that you were still human. The dreams would be the worst part. Not just nightmares, but dreams where you'd relive every execution in perfect detail. You'd see the faces of the condemned, hear their final words, feel the weight of the axe in your hands. Sometimes you'd dream of botched executions, of axes that wouldn't cut cleanly, of victims who wouldn't die. You'd wake up exhausted, having spent your sleep rehearsing death over and over again. The gradual transformation would be almost imperceptible at first. You'd notice that food had lost its taste, that color seemed muted, that laughter sounded hollow. Slowly, inexorably, you'd become less human and more like a machine designed for killing. Your emotions would dull, your empathy would wither, and your capacity for love would shrink until it was just a memory of what you once were. But the most terrifying realization would come when you discovered that you'd become good at it. The day when swinging the axe felt natural, when the resistance of flesh and bone became familiar, when you could look into someone's eyes and feel nothing at all. That's when you'd know you crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, entered a darkness that would never release you. So tell me, do you still think you could handle the daily reality of being death's servant? Could you wake up each morning knowing that today might be the day you'd have to look into a child's eyes and end their life? Could you carry the weight of so many souls on your conscience until your own death finally set you free? The next time you complain about your mundane problems, remember the man who lived in a house of death, who slept with the screams of the condemned, who traded his humanity for a handful of coins and the terrible efficiency of a perfect execution. And pray that you never have to discover what you're truly capable of when society demands it of you. You think you've seen the depths of this abyss? Oh, sweet innocent soul, you haven't even glimpsed the true horror yet. Let me drag you deeper into the executioner's world, where the line between justice and madness dissolves like blood and rain, and where the most terrifying discovery isn't what you become. It's what you were always capable of becoming. The first time you enjoy it, that's when you know you're truly damned. It creeps up on you like a cancer, so slowly you don't notice until it's too late. One day you're trembling as you raise the axe. The next you're savoring the perfect arc of the blade, the satisfying resistance of flesh and bone, the wet finality of a clean cut. The crowd's roar becomes music to your ears, and their bloodlust feeds something dark and hungry that has awakened in your soul. You'd develop preferences. Some executioners favored the quick brutality of the axe, others the slow strangulation of the noose. A few became artists of agony, masters of methods that could stretch death across hours. You'd find yourself critiquing other executioners' work like a connoisseur, evaluating fine wine, noting their technique, their timing, their ability to read the crowd's hunger for spectacle. The condemned would sense this change in you. Where once they saw reluctance, now they'd see anticipation. Where once they found pity, now they'd encounter cold professional pride. The transformation would be visible in your eyes, the last flicker of humanity extinguished, replaced by the calculating gaze of a predator sizing up prey. Your reputation would spread beyond your town, beyond your region. Other executioners would seek you out, wanting to learn your techniques, to understand what made you so efficient. You'd become a celebrity in the darkest corners of medieval society, invited to prestigious executions like a star performer touring from court to court. The nobility would request you specifically for their enemies. Kings would summon you to handle matters of state that required expertise. Your name would be whispered in political circles, spoken with a mixture of respect and revulsion. You'd become more than an executioner. You'd become a weapon of the crown, a tool of terror wielded by those in power. But with fame came new horrors. The political executions were different from common criminal dispatches. These victims were often innocent of any crime except opposing the wrong person at the wrong time. They'd look at you with eyes full of injustice, pleading not for mercy, but for understanding. They'd speak of their families, their children, their dreams cut short by political necessity. These executions would carve deeper wounds in whatever remained of your conscience. The torture sessions were where you truly lose yourself. Not just the quick mercy of execution, but the slow, methodical extraction of information through pain. You'd learn to read the map of human suffering written in screams and tears. A skilled torturer could keep someone alive and conscious for days, applying just enough pressure to break the will without breaking the body. The tools of torture were more varied and sophisticated than the instruments of execution. The rack would stretch victims until their joints popped and their bones cracked. The thumbscrews would apply precise pressure to the most sensitive parts of the body. The Iron Maiden would embrace victims in a deadly hug of spikes. Each device required its own expertise, its own understanding of human anatomy and psychology. You'd become fluent in the language of pain, able to distinguish between the scream of broken bone and the wail of torn muscle. You'd know exactly how much pressure to apply, how long to maintain it, when to stop before causing permanent damage. The human body would become your instrument, and suffering would become your song. The psychological aspects of torture were even more complex than the physical. You'd learn to break minds, as well as bodies, to find the one thing each victim cared about most and use it against them. A parent's love for their children, a soldier's loyalty to his comrades, a priest's faith in God. These became weapons in your hands, more effective than any blade or flame. Some victims would try to befriend you, believing that human connection might save them. They'd share stories of their lives, their hopes, their fears, desperately trying to remind you that they were people, not just subjects for your craft. These attempts at humanity would hit you like physical blows, forcing you to confront the reality of what you'd become. Others would try to break you with their defiance, staring into your eyes with unbroken will, refusing to give you the satisfaction of their suffering. These were the ones who'd haunt you most, because they'd force you to escalate, to find new depths of cruelty to achieve your goals. They'd drag you deeper into the abyss just by refusing to surrender. The religious implications would weigh heavily on whatever remained of your soul. The church's position on executioners was complex. They were necessary for justice, but spiritually contaminating. Some priests would refuse you communion, seeing you as irredeemably tainted. Others would work with you, believing that your role was divinely ordained. The theological debates about your eternal fate would become academic exercises in your own damnation. You'd develop a personal relationship with death itself. Not the abstract concept, but death as a living entity, a partner in your work. You'd sense its presence in the moment before the blade fell, feel its satisfaction when a life ended cleanly. Some executioners claimed they could see death waiting in the corner of the execution chamber, nodding approvingly at their work. The seasonal festivals would take on new meaning. Christmas would remind you of all the fathers you prevented from coming home. Easter would mock you with promises of resurrection while you dealt only in finality. Halloween would feel like a family reunion, surrounded by the ghosts of all those you'd sent to the other side. Your dreams would evolve beyond simple nightmares. You'd dream of conversations with the dead, of execution grounds where the roles were reversed, of a final judgment where all your victims stood as witnesses against you. Sometimes you'd dream of perfection, executions so clean, so efficient, so beautiful that they became works of art. These dreams were more disturbing than the nightmares because they revealed how completely you'd embraced your role. The apprentices who came to learn from you would become mirrors of your own corruption. You'd watch them struggle with their first executions, remembering your own innocence, and you'd feel something that might have been grief for the person you used to be. But then, you'd teach them the techniques that had made you famous, passing on the knowledge like a plague infecting the next generation. The technical innovations would become your obsession. You'd experiment with new methods, new tools, new ways to make death more efficient or more spectacular. The executioner's craft was constantly evolving, and you'd become a pioneer in the field, pushing the boundaries of what was possible with human ingenuity applied to human destruction. The record-keeping would become meticulous. Each execution would be documented, cataloged, analyzed for future reference. You'd keep detailed notes on techniques, timing, crowd reactions, victim responses. Your workshop would become a library of death, filled with journals that recorded the final moments of hundreds of souls. The family business would expand beyond simple execution. You'd train your sons and nephews, creating a dynasty of death that would span generations. The skills would be passed down like any other trade, except the product was suffering and the raw materials were human lives. Your legacy would be measured not in goods produced or services rendered, but in the efficiency with which you could end a human existence. The political connections would grow stronger. You'd become a trusted advisor to judges and nobles, your expertise in death making you valuable for more than just executions. You'd be consulted on matters of punishment, on the psychological impact of different methods, on the theater of justice and how to make it more effective. But the most terrifying realization would come when you understood that you'd become necessary, not just to the justice system, but to society itself. People needed you to exist, needed someone to cross the lines they couldn't cross, to do the things they couldn't do. You'd become the repository of their collective darkness, the living embodiment of civilization's capacity for sanctioned brutality. The isolation would become complete. You'd exist in a world of your own creation, populated by the dead and the dying, where normal human emotions were luxuries you could no longer afford. Love, compassion, joy, these would become foreign concepts, remembered like half-forgotten dreams from a life you'd left behind. The final corruption would be the moment you realized you didn't want to stop. The power, the fear, the absolute control over life and death. It would become addictive. You'd crave the weight of the axe in your hands, the moment of perfect silence before the blade fell, the gasps of the crowd as another life ended at your command. You'd become the monster that medieval society needed, the creature that lived in the shadows, so that others could pretend they lived in the light. And the most horrifying truth would be that you'd chosen this path, step by step, execution by execution, until there was no way back to the person you used to be. So tell me, knowing the full depth of this transformation, do you still think you could resist the corruption? Could you maintain your humanity while becoming humanity's executioner? Or would you, like so many others, discover that the capacity for evil was always there, waiting for the right circumstances to bloom like a poisonous flower? The next time you judge someone for their choices, remember that we all carry within us the seeds of our own damnation. And sometimes, all it takes is the right job offer to water those seeds and watch them grow into something monstrous. You thought the transformation was complete? How beautifully wrong you are. The executioner's journey into darkness has deeper chambers, more twisted corridors, more horrifying revelations that would shatter your very conception of what it means to be human. Let me show you the final descent, where the boundary between executioner and victim dissolves, and you discover that in a world built on death, everyone is just waiting for their turn. The paranoia would consume you like a fever. Every shadow could hide an assassin. Every stranger could be the relative of someone you'd killed. Every knock at your door could be death finally coming to collect its due. You'd sleep with weapons within reach, eat only food you'd prepared yourself, trust no one completely. The hunter would become the hunted, and the irony would be as sharp as the blade you wielded. Your reputation would precede you wherever you went, spreading like a plague through whispered conversations and terrified glances. Children would be warned about you in bedtime stories. Lovers would frighten each other with tales of your deeds, and drunks would boast about having seen you work. You'd become a legend while still breathing, a myth walking among mortals who crossed themselves at your approach. The guilt would manifest in ways that would surprise you, not the clean guilt of regret, but something twisted and perverse. You'd find yourself obsessing over the executions that went wrong, not because you felt sorry for the victims, but because the imperfection offended your professional pride. A botched beheading would haunt you more than the life you'd taken because it represented a failure in your craft. The nightmares would evolve beyond simple replays of your work. You'd dream of being on the executioner's block yourself, feeling the rough wood against your knees, hearing the crowd's bloodthirsty roar, seeing the axe descend toward your own neck. These dreams would be so vivid that you'd wake up feeling phantom pain where the blade should have fallen, your hand reflexively checking that your head was still attached. The relationship with your tools would become deeply intimate, almost sexual in its intensity. You'd caress them like lovers, whisper to them in the darkness, feel genuine affection for the instruments that had made you famous. Some executioners would name their favorite axe after a woman they'd loved, creating a twisted triangle of devotion between man, weapon, and memory. The apprentices who came to learn from you would become your children in darkness. You'd watch them struggle with their first kills, remembering your own innocence, and feel something that might have been paternal pride when they finally embraced their role. You'd teach them not just technique, but philosophy, how to find meaning in meaninglessness, how to make peace with being the avatar of society's darkest impulses. The political machinations would become more complex as your reputation grew. You'd be courted by different factions, each wanting to use your skills against their enemies. The executioner's axe would become a pawn in games of power, and you'd learn to navigate the treacherous waters of court politics while maintaining your professional neutrality. A skilled executioner could topple kingdoms simply by refusing to serve certain masters. The religious crisis would deepen as you aged. The question of your eternal soul would become more pressing with each passing year, each additional death on your conscience. Some executioners would become fanatically religious, believing that their work was divinely ordained. Others would abandon faith entirely, embracing the darkness as their true calling. A few would go mad trying to reconcile their actions with their beliefs. The physical toll would be as devastating as the psychological one. Years of swinging heavy axes would destroy your shoulders and back. The constant tension would give you headaches that felt like nails being driven into your skull. Your hands would become gnarled claws, permanently shaped by the grip of your tools. Your eyes would develop a 1,000-yard stare, looking through people rather than at them. The family legacy would become your greatest burden. Your children would inherit not just your skills, but your reputation, your enemies, your curses. They'd grow up knowing that their father was the bogeyman, that their bloodline was tainted with the essence of death itself. Some would embrace the family business. Others would flee to distant lands, trying to escape the shadow of their heritage. The crowds would change over the years, but their hunger for blood would remain constant. You'd learn to read their moods like a skilled performer, knowing when they wanted spectacle and when they wanted efficiency. The relationship between executioner and audience would become a dark form of entertainment, with you as the star of the most macabre show on earth. The technical innovations would become your obsession. You'd experiment with new methods, new angles, new ways to make death more artistic. The pursuit of the perfect execution would consume you, driving you to study anatomy, physics, even engineering. You'd become a scientist of death, constantly refining your methods in the laboratory of human suffering. The dreams of the condemned would begin to bleed into your waking hours. You'd find yourself finishing conversations they'd started in your sleep, responding to questions they'd asked moments before you killed them. The boundary between life and death would blur until you existed in a twilight realm where the living and the dead coexisted in your consciousness. The seasonal patterns would become rituals of remembrance. Spring would bring memories of young victims cut down before they could bloom. Summer would echo with the screams of those who died in the heat, their blood evaporating in the sun. Autumn would remind you of lives harvested like grain, and winter would freeze your heart with the memory of executions performed in the bitter cold. The apprentice's first kills would become your vicarious redemption. Through their innocence, you'd try to recapture something of your own lost humanity. You'd watch them struggle with the same demons that had consumed you, and sometimes you'd try to guide them away from the darkness. But more often, you'd simply watch them fall, knowing that their corruption was as inevitable as death itself. The political prisoners would be the ones who'd challenge you most profoundly. Unlike common criminals, these victims often possessed intelligence, education, and moral conviction. They'd engage you in philosophical discussions about justice, morality, and the nature of evil. Some would try to convert you, to save your soul, even as you prepared to end their lives. Others would simply stare at you with pity, seeing you as more condemned than they were. The torture sessions would become exercises in psychology as much as brutality. You'd learn to read the subtle signs of breaking, to know exactly when a victim was ready to confess, to understand the complex interplay between pain and will. The human mind would become your laboratory, and suffering would become your research method. The records you kept would become a chronicle of human darkness, page after page of names, dates, methods, and final words. A library of death that documented the worst impulses of civilization. Sometimes you'd read through these records like a scholar studying ancient texts, trying to find patterns or meaning in the catalog of lives you'd ended. The other executioners would become your only true peers. When you met at gatherings or festivals, you'd share stories and techniques like craftsmen comparing their work. But there would always be an underlying competition, a need to prove who was the most skilled, the most feared, the most efficient. Even in this brotherhood of darkness, there could be no true fellowship. The moments of doubt would come at unexpected times. A child's laugh in the street, a lover's gentle touch, a sunset that reminded you of beauty beyond death. These would pierce through your armor of indifference and remind you of what you'd lost. But these moments would pass quickly, driven away by the weight of your reputation and the impossibility of redemption. The final realization would be that you'd become something beyond human comprehension. Not just a killer, but a force of nature, a living embodiment of mankind's capacity for sanctioned evil. You'd transcend individual identity and become a symbol, a warning, a reminder that civilization's greatest horrors are always performed by ordinary people who simply accept their role in the machine of death. The legacy would outlive you by centuries. Your name would be whispered in dark corners. Your methods would be studied and refined. Your reputation would grow with each retelling. You'd become immortal in the worst possible way, forever remembered as the man who perfected the art of ending human life. But the most terrifying truth would be this. Somewhere in the depths of your corrupted soul, you'd be proud of what you'd accomplished. The efficiency, the artistry, the fear you'd inspired. These would be your monuments, your contributions to history. You'd die knowing that you'd been the best at what you did, even if what you did was monstrous. So tell me, after witnessing this complete transformation, do you still harbor any illusions about your own moral strength? Do you still believe that there's some line you wouldn't cross? Some depth of depravity you wouldn't sink to if the circumstances were right? Or do you now understand that the executioner's true horror isn't what he becomes, but what he reveals about the darkness that exists within us all? The next time you pass judgment on someone else's choices, remember that we're all just one opportunity away from becoming the monsters we claim to despise. And sometimes the most terrifying realization is that the monster was always there, waiting patiently for someone to give it permission to emerge. And now we reach the end of our journey into the abyss, where the executioner's story concludes, not with redemption or justice, but with the cold, inescapable truth that some transformations are irreversible. Let me whisper to you the final chapter of this nightmare, where death comes not as an enemy, but as the only friend who has never judged you for what you've become. Your own death would be the ultimate irony. After decades of delivering death to others, you'd finally face it yourself, and the fear would be unlike anything you'd ever experienced. Not the clean terror of your victims, but the complex horror of someone who knows exactly what death looks like, who has seen it from every angle except the one that matters most, from the inside. The deathbed confessions would pour out like blood from a severed artery. All the names, all the faces, all the final words that had been locked away in the vault of your memory would spill forth in a torrent of guilt and madness. The priest summoned to deliver last rites would flee in terror, unable to bear the weight of so much accumulated sin. You'd die as you lived, alone, feared, and utterly isolated from human compassion. But even in death, you wouldn't find peace. The executioner's curse would follow you beyond the grave, binding you to the earth with chains forged from the screams of your victim. You'd become a ghost haunting the execution grounds, a specter of guilt and violence that would terrify future generations. Your torment would be eternal, your punishment a perfect reflection of the suffering you'd inflicted on others. The family line would be cursed for generations. Your children would bear the mark of your profession, carrying the stain of your reputation like a hereditary disease. They'd flee to distant lands, change their names, deny their heritage, but the darkness would follow them. The sins of the father would be visited upon the sons, and the executioner's bloodline would be tainted forever. The tools of your trade would become cursed relics. The axe that had separated so many heads from bodies would be feared and revered, passed down through generations of executioners like a dark heirloom. Some would claim it was possessed by the spirits of the dead, others that it thirsted for blood like a living thing. The weapon would outlive its wielder, continuing to serve death long after you joined its victim. The execution grounds would become a place of pilgrimage for those seeking to understand the nature of evil. Scholars would study the bloodstains that never quite washed away. Theologians would debate the spiritual implications of sanctioned murder, and the morbidly curious would come to feel the lingering presence of so much accumulated death. The place would become a monument to humanity's capacity for cruelty. The stories would grow in the telling. Your reputation would expand beyond the bounds of reality, becoming legend, then myth, then something approaching religious doctrine. You'd be transformed from a man into a symbol, from a historical figure into an archetype of absolute evil. The truth of your humanity would be lost, replaced by the more comfortable fiction of you as monster. The modern world would struggle to comprehend what you represented. In an age of sanitized death and clinical execution, the medieval executioner would seem like a relic from a darker time. But the truth would be more disturbing, that the capacity for such evil still exists, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge. The executioner's story would serve as a warning that civilization is always just one step away from barbarism. The psychological studies would dissect your transformation like anatomists examining a corpse. Researchers would try to understand how an ordinary person could become such a monster. What combination of circumstances and choices led to such complete moral corruption? They'd create theories and models, but they'd never truly understand the simple truth, that evil is not an aberration, but a choice we make every day. The victims' families would carry their hatred through generations. The executioner's descendants would face revenge attacks, blood feuds, and endless cycles of violence. The original crime would spawn countless others, each act of vengeance creating new grievances, new reasons for hatred. The executioner's legacy would be written in blood across the centuries. The religious implications would echo through theological debates for generations. The question of whether an executioner could be saved, whether their actions were justified by divine command or condemned by moral law, would divide scholars and believers. Some would argue that the executioner was a necessary evil, others that they were irredeemably damned. The truth would remain elusive, lost in the complexity of faith and morality. The apprentices you trained would carry your methods into the future, spreading the techniques and philosophy you'd developed. They'd become masters in their own right, training new generations of executioners, creating a dynasty of death that would span centuries. Your influence would ripple through time, touching lives and ending them long after your own death. The political consequences would reshape kingdoms. The fear you inspired would be used as a tool of oppression, your reputation as a weapon of psychological warfare. Rulers would invoke your name to terrorize their enemies, and the mere threat of calling in your successors would be enough to quell rebellions. The executioner's legacy would become a cornerstone of authoritarian power. The technological innovations you pioneered would be refined and improved by future generations. The methods you developed would evolve, becoming more efficient, more spectacular, more terrifying. The art of execution would advance like any other craft, with each generation building upon the knowledge of their predecessors. Progress would be measured not in lives saved, but in lives ended more effectively. The dreams of the condemned would achieve a kind of immortality. Their final nightmares would be absorbed into your consciousness, becoming part of your own eternal torment. You'd carry their terrors with you into death, and those fears would linger in the places where you'd worked, creating a psychic residue that would haunt future generations. The executioner's code would be passed down like sacred scripture. The rules and rituals you developed would become gospel for future practitioners, your methods elevated to the status of religious doctrine. The craft would develop its own theology, its own moral framework, its own justifications for the unjustifiable. The final execution would be your own, not by the hand of another, but by the accumulated weight of all the lives you'd taken. Your body would simply give up, unable to carry the burden of so much death any longer. You'd die not from disease or injury, but from the sheer toxicity of your own existence. But even in death, the horror would continue. Your grave would be desecrated by those seeking revenge. Your body would be denied proper burial. Your name would be cursed in prayers and blasphemed in taverns. You'd become a cautionary tale, a warning about the price of choosing evil over good. The executioner's true punishment would be the knowledge that you'd had a choice. At every step of your journey into darkness, you could have turned back, could have chosen differently, could have remained human. The torture of that realization would be worse than any physical pain. The understanding that your damnation was entirely self-inflicted. The legacy would be written in the language of nightmares. Poets would craft verses about your deeds. Artists would paint portraits of your victims. Musicians would compose dirges for the lives you'd ended. Culture itself would be shaped by your story, with your name becoming synonymous with the worst impulses of human nature. The truth would be more terrifying than any fiction. The real horror of the executioner's story isn't the blood or the suffering or the death. It's the gradual, methodical destruction of a human soul. It's the proof that anyone, given the right circumstances, can become a monster. It's the reminder that civilization is just a thin veneer over the abyss of human cruelty. The executioner's final lesson would be this: evil is not something that happens to us, but something we choose. It's not a force from outside, but a darkness within. The capacity for monstrosity exists in every human heart, waiting for the right opportunity to emerge. The executioner's story is not an aberration, it's a warning. So now you know the complete truth about why you wouldn't last a day as a medieval executioner. Not because you couldn't handle the physical demands or the technical challenges, but because you'd either break under the psychological pressure or become something so monstrous that you'd no longer be recognizably human. The executioner's fate is not death. but the living death of absolute moral corruption. The next time you pass judgment on the choices others have made, remember that we're all carrying the potential for both good and evil within us. The executioner's axe isn't just a weapon. It's a mirror, reflecting back the darkness that exists in every human soul. And sometimes, the most terrifying thing you can discover is not what others are capable of, but what you yourself might do if the circumstances were right. Sleep well tonight, knowing that you've stared into the abyss and seen your own reflection staring back. And remember, in a world where ordinary people can become monsters, the only thing standing between civilization and chaos is the choice we make every single day to remain human. The executioner's story ends here, but the questions it raises will follow you forever, because now you know the truth, that the capacity for evil isn't something alien and foreign, but something as human as love, as natural as breathing, as close as the beating of your own heart.